this Saturday.
Welcome to Revelation 8 TV. Live stream starting soon.
Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to share, like, and comment during the show. Need prayers or want to be a guest speaker? Inbox Revelation to make it happen. Plus, you can play commercials for your upcoming event here on Revelation 8 TV for a donation or gift. Contact us for more details.
This is the story of a unique and terrifying book.
You have beasts, the devil at work.
Its visions have inspired and scared for 2,000 years. Many see in the pages of the Book of Revelation an uncanny series of predictions: global warming, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, war in the Middle East.
There is no more perfect battleground in the world than this.
Some believe the book is a guide to one of the greatest riddles of all, a date for the end of the world. Could the Book of Revelation hold such a secret? New evidence has revealed that the key to the mystery of this last book in the Bible lies in the dust of modern-day Turkey, and that the infamous number of the beast may not be 666 after all. To understand Revelation, we need to know who wrote it and where. Approximately 60 years after the death of Jesus, a collection of scrolls was delivered to the small Christian community in Ephesus in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. The scrolls contained what is now known as the Book of Revelation. The author's name was in the book, John. Tradition says that this is the disciple John, the fisherman's son of Zebedee, the writer of John's Gospel, who looked after Mary, Jesus' mother, after her son's crucifixion. Yet in Revelation, John never describes himself as a disciple of Jesus, nor writes as if he ever knew him. Now, new scientific methods can help resolve the question of who the author really was. Sir Anthony Kenny is a leading expert in stylometry, which analyzes writing technique.
The things that are most characteristic of authors are not special words that are their favorites, but the frequency with which they use very common words.
Two of these common words examined by Sir Anthony were de, a word similar to but, and kai, meaning and.
The word and is twice as frequent in the Book of Revelation as it is in any other book of the New Testament, whereas the Gospel of John is not particularly fond of and, its use is less than average. On the other hand, the Greek word de, which is very frequent in any other Greek text I've ever met, occurs only 7 times in the whole of the Book of Revelation.
Sir Anthony carried out 99 similar tests on Revelation and John's Gospel. His results were conclusive.
I could, by using a simple statistical technique, put together these 99 tests into a particular way of discriminating between texts. And it was at the outcome of that that I saw that the fourth gospel and the book of Revelation were right apart. I think that it's extremely unlikely that the two books were written by the same author.
So the case for John the disciple writing the book of Revelation doesn't seem a strong one. Greg Carey, an expert in the meaning of Revelation, believes there are further clues in the book that can point us to the author.
John addresses his audience in such a direct way. He says, "I, John, your brother," as if he's someone who knows them and whom they will recognize. The book of Revelation begins with a series of 7 letters to churches that are located in what we call Asia Minor or southwestern Turkey. Each letter addresses a single church, congratulates it for its virtues, or admonishes it for its faults, so that one assumes that John knew these churches and had been present among them.
And there's a further indication that John was writing to a congregation. John's Apocalypse, which means Revelation, describes colorful visions of angels and monsters. The letter, likely to have been dictated to a scribe, is clearly no routine correspondence to a Christian church. John has something important to say, and he uses his audience's imagination to help get his point across.
It's important to remember that the book of Revelation was written to be heard. John blesses those who hear the words of the prophecy, as well as the one who reads it, presumably aloud to an audience. In other words, the book was written to have an effect upon people who weren't studying it like we read books today, but were experiencing it through their imaginations, much as modern audiences listen to radio programs.
And there was a clear need for a revelation to be written for the ear and not the eye.
Most early Christian communities would have had a few people who were literate, and they would most likely be the leaders of that particular community. But the majority would be illiterate. And this was a reflection of society generally.
So John was almost certainly a man of authority in the church, writing to his flocks in Asia Minor. Yet that raises a fundamental question. 7-headed demons, 4 terrifying horsemen, are unusual images, even by first-century standards. What made John draw on such fearsome images to convey his message? To understand the true meaning of the book, we need to go back to its roots. According to the Bible, John wrote Revelation on the island of Patmos off the Turkish coast, at that time under the control of the Roman Empire.
John tells his audience that he's on the island because of the Word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Whenever the book of Revelation mentions the testimony of Jesus, it connects it to suffering. In fact, the Greek word martus for witness has become our word martyr, and it takes that usage first in the book of Revelation.
If John was suffering on Patmos, then was he a prisoner of the Romans? Ian Boxall is an expert on the author of Revelation.
This is the cave where, according to tradition, John has his visions. You can see the place over there where traditionally he laid his head, and then, not being quite so agile, there's a grip for him to lever himself up. John, according to all the traditions, is here as an exile. They differ precisely as to why he was here, who exiled him, but they all agree that he was here as a result of his Christian belief.
Although there is no archaeological evidence of a Roman prison, the location of the island suggests it served a military purpose. Patmos may have been one of a number of fortress islands defending the important Roman seaport of Miletus, about 40 miles away on the mainland. It was an ideal place to detain exiles. But if John was in exile, it seems strange that he had the freedom to find a cave, see visions, write them down, and then to send the documents to his churches back on the mainland. This may well be due to the way Rome exiled troublemakers.
When Roman authorities would place someone in exile, he would have had quite a bit of freedom. He wouldn't have been imprisoned. He would have only been excluded from appearing in certain regions, or he would have been told that he had to restrict his movements to just this one island. But he may have been able to carry on a correspondence through intermediaries who would sail from the island back to the mainland and return, so that he may have been able to keep in touch with the churches he was addressing.
Despite this freedom to communicate, John was still trapped on Patmos, separated from the Christian churches in Asia Minor. This sense of frustration may have led John to write Revelation with its violent images of worldwide catastrophe. The theory is that John was furious with the Romans for persecuting him and his fellow Christians.
There's a lot of anger in Revelation and a yearning for justice to be done. And that's often been seen as a direct result of Roman persecution of Christians.
On the face of it, John had every reason to be angry. The established view is that in the first century, the Roman authorities systematically persecuted Christians across the empire. It was believed that the violence started about 20 years before Revelation was written, under the reign of the Emperor Nero in AD 64.
Tradition has it that Nero blamed the Christians for the tragic and catastrophic fire that devastated the city in that year. Some Christians were crucified and used their bodies as torches to light the pathways into the city. It was such a devastating experience that the memories of Nero stayed within early Christian communities.
Most academics agree that Nero did persecute Christians. But Revelation probably wasn't written under Nero. It's been dated to around AD 90, in the reign of the Emperor Domitian. And evidence in Revelation itself seems to show that Domitian was far less brutal than Nero. If Revelation had been motivated by the persecution of John's community, then you might expect him to list a host of martyrs by name. In fact, Revelation mentions only one.
The book is obsessed with those who have died on account of their testimony to Jesus, numbers them in the thousands. But he only names one, a believer named Antipas who has died on account of his testimony.
Although John does mention the death of the martyr Antipas, there's now evidence that the Emperor Domitian may not have the blood of many Christians on his hands after all.
Recent historians have begun to question whether Domitian actually did persecute Christians, and indeed whether he was quite the tyrant that he was made out to be by later historians. There's not a great deal of evidence for that when one begins to scratch the surface.
So if Christians were not being systematically persecuted, it's hard to imagine how Revelation could have had any impact on its audience. John must have had another target. These second-century ruins hold a vital clue as to what drove John to write Revelation and whether the book really does have the key to the end of the world. The ancient city of Pergamum lies 200 miles north of Ephesus in modern-day Turkey, and it was a major political and religious center in the Roman province of Asia Minor. It was also home to one of the fledgling Christian communities who first received the Book of Revelation. But Dan Showalter, an expert in biblical archaeology, believes that Pergamum's pagan temples give the greatest insight into what concerned John.
The partially reconstructed remains give us a good idea of what an impressive building this would have been. But it was actually in the courtyard around the temple where most of the activity would have taken place. There would have been sacrifice on an altar in front of the temple. The people would have gathered around, would have sung songs, would have offered prayers and vows. And then when the ceremony was over, they might have been able to take home some meat to help supplement their diet.
John was familiar with pagan worship, but this religious practice was growing in popularity and was in direct conflict with Christianity. It had begun around 100 years before Domitian with the building of temples to a new god, the Emperor Augustus.
There would have been sacrifices that took place at the imperial temple where people in the city would have gathered and participated in honoring both the presence and power of Rome and the emperor as an individual.
This idolatry spread across Asia Minor throughout the 1st century. Every city in the Roman Empire had many temples, but this was one built to worship and give thanks to a living person, an imperial god. And here may lie the key to Revelation. For John, this cult of the emperor would have been a terrible blasphemy.
John would have resisted the imperial cult because it stood against the belief in Jesus that he was so interested in promoting.
John is a Jewish Christian, and he knows there's only one true God. So he cannot, because of his upbringing, compromise in any way on that basic fact.
But the most compelling evidence that the Roman Empire, and especially the imperial cult, was John's target, comes from one of his most frightening visions, a terrifying beast who makes war against God's people. The beast, he writes, demands worship. And this gives the first clue as to what it really represents.
Worship of the imperial gods had become extremely popular, to the degree that persons who didn't participate may have been perceived as disloyal.
In this strange vision, the beast had not one head, but 7. By John's time, 7 emperors had ruled the empire.
John tells us that these are 7 kings or rulers. And though scholars can't agree on which Roman emperors these 7 heads may represent, they seem to represent Roman imperial power. John also associates the beast with 7 hills. And of course, the city of Rome was known then as it is now as the city of 7 hills.
To many academics, these cryptic but repeated references to the beast show that John's target isn't Roman persecution, but the paganism of the imperial cult. However, that can't be the whole story. John's audience, as fellow Christians, would have shared his views, and therefore there had been no need to write such a letter. But a closer look at the text of Revelation reveals just why John felt it was so important to send his message. John, it seems, may have been alarmed about the behavior of some members of his flock. One such church was to be found in another part of the Roman Empire. To the south of Pergamum was the ancient city of Ephesus.
Standing on this square in the ancient city of Ephesus, it's easy to get a sense of the Ephesus that John would have known. The streets would have been full of people, the shops full of people selling their wares. This was an ancient port city where people would have come from all over the Mediterranean world and beyond to trade, to share ideas, and sometimes to share religions.
In this Mediterranean cultural melting pot, the Christian church would have been a tiny minority.
A theater like this would hold 25,000 people, and the Christian community, the churches here, would probably account for a very small percentage of that. The Christians probably would have filled up only a couple of rows.
The pressure on these communities was great, especially in a thriving pagan center like Ephesus. Pressure that could weaken the faith of a struggling church.
Their neighbors were continually celebrating the various gods who were popular in the region, as well as the imperial gods of Rome, and on occasion even the emperor himself. Symbols of the various deities would be all around them.
One of the major issues for somebody like John seems not to be the fact that they are suffering persecution, but the fact that they've just become too comfortable. They've settled down. They've found their place in society. And he's wanted to shake them up a bit.
If John was writing to those Christians who had begun to worship Rome's emperors, it would help explain why the last book of the Bible was written. The visions were less about prophesying the future and more about chastising those who had joined the imperial cult. But there is something left unanswered. The vivid apocalyptic images which have captured the imagination of millions of Christians for centuries. What possible meaning could these visions have had for John's churches? Maybe they had little to do with the cult of the divine emperor and everything to do with the visions of a terrifying future. To those who lived 2,000 years ago, John's visions of the four horsemen, Armageddon, and the beast may have held entirely different meanings than today. Some see them now as signs for the end of the world, but that's not necessarily what John meant. The word apocalyptic had a different emphasis then.
Many people, when they hear the word apocalyptic, think about the end of the world. But that's only part of this great tradition.
In fact, there had been other apocalypses or revelations written in the previous 200 years. The key feature of apocalyptic literature is that it claims to reveal God's will directly. It's a message that no ordinary mortal would have access to.
They're all stories. A single human visionary has this dramatic revelatory experience, and he requires the assistance of a heavenly being to explain what he's seeing and experiencing. So the apocalypses unfold as stories describing these experiences.
Apocalypses promise their readers an escape from the harsh reality of everyday life. For first-century Christians, John's writings offer a world where their faith triumphs.
They promise their audience God's world. It's either in the heavenly realms or it's coming in the future. And it's a world where the faithful will be rewarded for their faithfulness, and where justice will prevail, and where wickedness will be judged.
John was in good company. Some scholars believe that Jesus himself was deeply influenced by apocalyptic literature. One of the most famous prayers in the world seems to share the same themes as the book of Revelation.
When the disciples of Jesus ask him to teach them how to pray, then Jesus teaches them to say the Lord's Prayer. And that prayer can be read apocalyptically. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That implies that the kingdom of God has not yet come to earth, that the will of God is not being done on earth. So that's like the book of Revelation, seeing God and Christ exalted in heaven.
And the Lord's Prayer may even have a beast of its own.
As God's kingdom began to come, then the powers of evil would do their uttermost to battle against it. So you have beasts, you have the devil at work. And that's probably what is meant at the end of the Lord's Prayer. Lead us not into the trial, but deliver us from evil, or probably deliver us from the evil one, deliver us from the power of Satan.
If Jesus used apocalyptic imagery, why not his follower John? Perhaps this tradition of apocalyptic writing can help decipher some of John's visions, like the infamous 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These terrifying beings appear first in a text from the Old Testament, the book of the prophet Zechariah. But John didn't just copy these images. His genius lay in updating them for the first century. In Zechariah, each horse is linked with a particular color. John takes this idea, but gives it a new twist. His first century audience would probably have understood the meaning of the colors. Ian Boxall believes he can crack John's code.
John seems to make the significance of the colors more explicit. You have a red horse. Red's the color of blood, and according to tradition, the color of kind of idolatrous luxury which has brought Rome its current dominance, but at the expense of so much blood being shed.
The rider on the black horse seems to symbolize famine and disaster, the aftermath of war. Then there is a pale or green horse, the sickly color of death itself. But one horseman described by John, the rider on the white horse, has a bow in his hand. This suggests vengeance is on John's mind, and he believes it will come at the hand of Rome's sworn enemy.
Now, your average Christian would know that the great enemy of Rome, the great threat to Rome on the east, the Parthian Empire, had a cavalry which carried bows. The Parthians are on their way, and the ultimate effect of this will be the destruction of this apparently impregnable empire.
So even the vision of the 4 horsemen is part of John's encouragement to the Christian church that the empire's days were numbered. But the 4 horsemen are not the only apocalyptic images in the book. Just as famous is Armageddon, the battlefield where Revelation says the forces of good and evil will wage war. Archaeological evidence shows that this image too is meant to evoke hatred of the Romans. This is Megiddo, in the Jezreel Valley in modern-day Israel. Archaeologists believe that its name holds a clue to the site of Armageddon.
In Hebrew, the site of Megiddo was actually Har Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo. And we go from Har Megiddo to Harmageddon to Armageddon. And indeed, in some of the earliest versions of the New Testament, written in Greek, Armageddon has an aspirant at the beginning, meaning it's pronounced with an H. So it originally was Harmageddon, and you can get from Har Megiddo to Harmageddon very easily.
This tranquil site seems an unlikely place for John to choose as the location for the battle at the end of the world. But in fact, it was entirely appropriate.
The Jezreel Valley would have been the bloodiest place in Palestine that John knew about. At the time that John is writing in the 1st century AD, there had already been 12 or 13 battles fought either at Megiddo or in the Jezreel Valley itself. Napoleon supposedly said, "There is no more perfect battleground in the world than this." And looking over the Jezreel Valley, I have no trouble believing that.
Archaeologists believe there's also a very practical reason why John chose Megiddo as his battle site. In his time, it was the base for one of the most brutal armies in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Roman 6th Legion.
We know that the Romans located their camp here, the camp for the 6th Legion. They were continuing the job that ancient Megiddo always did throughout history, protecting the area, controlling the pass, controlling the trade routes.
The 6th Legion had a nickname that reflected their strength and ruthlessness in battle. They were called the Ironsides.
The Ironsides have a particularly nasty reputation amongst Roman legions. They were known for their brutality. They would have used all the known means that we know the Romans did against subduing populations, crucifying them, flaying them alive. They crucified people all the way from the coast to Jerusalem.
So where better to place a battle between the forces of good and evil than at the headquarters of an army whose reputation caused fear across the empire?
Anybody at that time would have known that the legionnaires were camped here. These were the forces of darkness at Megiddo.
John realized that any major battle fought for control of this region or control of the world is going to have to involve Megiddo. It had been so crucial in previous battles. From his point of view, there was no reason to suppose that it wouldn't be crucial in upcoming battles.
If John's aim in Revelation is not to predict the end of the world, but to attack the Roman Empire using contemporary events and ancient apocalyptic tradition, then perhaps we can look differently at the most famous prophecy of all. 666, the number of the beast. If the beast means the emperor, then what did John mean by its number? The ancient world loved puzzles. A common trick was to use numbers to disguise a name. In the Greek and Hebrew alphabets, every letter had a corresponding number. So if you added up the total value of the letters in your name, you had a numerical code.
So here's a good example. Anna, written in Greek capitals, which just happen to be the same as ours. Now the number for A, alpha, is 1, and the number for N is 50. So do a bit of simple arithmetic. And you end up with 102 as the number of the name of Anna.
Ancient graffiti has survived that suggests this game had a mainly frivolous purpose.
There's quite a nice one that was found in Pompeii, written on a wall somewhere. I love the girl whose number is 545. Now, she knew that her number was 545. Others perhaps had to do a bit of working out to find out precisely who she was.
But for John, this game is deadly serious. He gives us the puzzle in reverse. He gives the number and invites his audience to work back to the name. He writes in Revelation, "Let him who is understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is a human number. Its number is 666. For historians, the answer seems obvious.
Now, the best explanation is that John is thinking of the Emperor Nero. And if you write the name Nero Caesar in the Hebrew alphabet, then you end up with this: 50, 200, 6, 50, 100, 60, and 200, which then, with a little bit of swift arithmetic, gives us the number of Nero Caesar.
666 seems to be an ancient code linking the Emperor Nero with the number of the beast. But a collection of recently deciphered documents has cast doubt on whether 666 is really the number of the beast after all. "100 years ago, a group of British archaeologists digging in the ancient Egyptian city of Oxyrhynchus made a fascinating discovery. Not buried treasure, but waste paper in a rubbish tip 30 feet deep. This vast hoard was brought back to Oxford, where ever since it has been cleaned, catalogued, and translated. Then in 1999, a papyrus fragment was identified as a 3rd century extract from the Book of Revelation. Closer examination revealed that the world's most infamous number was not what it seemed.
You've got a tiny fragment here. It's written by somebody who was a good scribe, who wrote clearly and he wrote helpfully for people, but he also wrote quite quickly. And it has part of the line which would have read, "Let the person with understanding calculate the number." It would have been somewhere there. And then 3 letters, each standing for a numeral. The letters are Chi, which stands for 600, Iota, like our I, which stands for 10, and stigma at the end is a 6. So the number here, clear as daylight, 616.
If the number of the beast is 616, then it doesn't add up to Nero. It suggests that John's real target was someone else altogether. By applying the same rules of the number game, a new hate figure emerges: another Roman emperor.
Caligula was emperor from 37 to 41, and Caligula, in fact, was a nickname. His proper name was Gaius. Now, if we take Gaius Caesar and change it into Greek letters, we get Gaius Caesar. Giving a numerical value to each of the letters of that name, we end up with 284 for Gaius, and for Caesar, 332. So that gives us 616.
The reason why John would see Caligula as the beast lies in a controversial decision made by the emperor during his short reign. Caligula ordered a statue of himself to be put in the temple at Jerusalem. This was a blasphemy to the Jews because the temple was dedicated to the worship of their one true God.
It's very possible that it will continue to be unacceptable to early Christians with this strong folk memory of a defining act by a Roman emperor which stood up for everything which they found unacceptable in the imperial power.
So if Revelation isn't a prophecy about the end of the world, but an attack on Rome, where does that leave John's visions? Few scholars deny that John had visions. Indeed, visionary experiences are so common in other faiths that in John's case, they could have served to inspire his flock.
John's vision was within a Christian tradition, but it does seem to have many features that parallel that of shamans in other cultures. A shaman is somebody who can go into a controlled trance, who is able to travel to other worlds, other realms, in order to receive a message, who then returns in order to give that message or to heal somebody. And John, like shamans in many cultures, has a message which he communicates to others. It isn't something for him alone, it's a message for the community. He's there to heal his community, to support them, to encourage them, sometimes to correct them.
All the available evidence from recent archaeology and history suggests that the Book of Revelation is not a series of prophecies predicting the end of the world. Instead, it is an urgent message for a first-century audience in danger of being seduced by the Roman imperial cult.
Rather than seeing John on this island as gazing into the dim and distant future, rather like a clairvoyant gazing into a crystal ball, perhaps we should see John rather as sitting on this island gazing across the sea. The 7 churches are over there. He's got an urgent message for them, and he wants them to hear it.
Yet one stubborn question remains about John's prophecies. If Revelation is simply a church leader's attack on decadent first-century Christians, why does John seem to have an uncanny gift of foretelling future events? Are these just coincidences, or, as some people claim, accurate predictions of the end of the world? John's list of apparent predictions is impressive. Revelation talks about dramatic climate change, the seas drying up, and unbearable heat.
In recent years, scientists, of course, have warned us with increasing urgency about global warming, about the greenhouse effect, with possibilities of increasing levels of skin cancers, with effects of global warming on the water systems of the world.
Another apparent prediction talks of the drying up of the river Euphrates to make way for the armies of the Kingdom of the East, who would number 200 million.
In recent years, there have been a number of proposals to build dams on the Euphrates.
Revelations, by the way, is named at the beginning. It was written by John, which could refer to the beloved disciple who wrote the Gospel and the letters of John, or it could be a different John, a messianic Jewish prophet who traveled about and taught in the early church. Whichever John it was, he makes clear in the opening paragraph what kind of book he has written. He calls it, first of all, a revelation or apocalypse. The Greek word is apokalypsis, and it refers to a type of literature very familiar to John's readers from the Hebrew scriptures and from other popular Jewish texts. Apocalypses recounted a prophet's symbolic dreams and visions that revealed God's heavenly perspective on history and current events so that the present could be viewed in light of history's final outcome. And John says this apocalypse is a prophecy, which means it's a word from God spoken through a prophet to God's people, usually to warn or comfort them in a time of crisis. By calling this book a prophecy, John's saying that it stands in the tradition of the biblical prophets and is bringing their message to a climax. And this apocalyptic prophecy was sent to real people that John knew. The book opens and closes as a circular letter that was sent to 7 churches in the ancient Roman province of Asia. Now, 7 is a meaningful number for John. It's a symbol of completeness based on the 7-day Sabbath cycle in the Old Testament. And John has woven 7s into every single part of this book. Now, with this opening, John has given us clear guidance about how he wants us to understand this book. Jewish apocalypses communicated through symbolic imagery and numbers. It is not a secret predictive code about the timing of the end of the world. Rather, John is constantly using these symbols that are drawn from the Old Testament, and he expects his readers to go discover what the symbols mean by looking up the text he's alluding to. Also, the fact that it's a letter means that John is actually addressing the situation of these first century churches. And so while this book has much to say to Christians of later generations, the book's meaning must first be anchored in the historical context of John's time, place, and audience, which brings us into the book's first section, Jesus' message to the 7 churches. John was exiled on the island of Patmos, and he saw a vision of the risen Jesus exalted as King of the world. And he was standing among 7 burning lights. And John's told this is a symbol of the 7 churches in Asia Minor that's been adapted from the book of the prophet Zechariah. And Jesus starts addressing the specific problems that face each church. Some were apathetic due to wealth and affluence. Others were morally compromised. Their people were still eating ritual meals and sleeping around in pagan temples. In these churches who does conquer. Each reward is drawn directly from the book's final vision about the marriage of heaven and earth. And so this opening section, it sets up the main plot tension that will drive the storyline in this book. Will Jesus' people endure? Will they inherit the new world that God has in store? And why is faithfulness to Jesus described as conquering? The rest of the book is John's answer. After this, John has a vision of God's heavenly throne room, and he describes it with imagery drawn from many Old Testament prophets. Surrounding God are creatures and elders that represent all creation and human nations, and they're giving honor and allegiance to the one true Creator God who is holy, holy, holy. In God's hand is a scroll that's closed up with 7 wax seals. It symbolizes the message of the Old Testament prophets and the sealed scroll of Daniel's visions. These are all about how God's kingdom will come here fully on earth as in heaven. But it turns out no one is able to open the scroll until John hears of someone who can. It's the Lion from the tribe of Judah and the root of David. He can open it. These are classic Old Testament descriptions of the Messianic king who would bring God's kingdom through military conquest. Now, that's what John hears. But then what he turns and sees is not an aggressive lion king, but a sacrificed bloody lamb who's alive, standing there, and ready to open the scroll. Now, this symbol of Jesus as the slain lamb, this is crucially important for understanding the book. John's saying that the Old Testament promise of God's future victorious kingdom was inaugurated through the crucified Messiah. Jesus overcame his enemies by dying for them as the true Passover lamb so that they could be redeemed. Because of the resurrection, Jesus' death on the cross was not a defeat. It was his enthronement. It was the way he conquered evil. And so this vision concludes with the Lamb alongside the one sitting on the throne, and together they are worshipped as the one true creator and redeemer, and the slain Lamb begins to open the scroll. It's a symbol of his divine authority to guide history to its conclusion. Which brings us to the next section of the book, the 3 cycles of 7. 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls. And each cycle depicts God's kingdom and justice coming here on earth as in heaven. Now, some people think that the 3 sets of 7 divine judgments represent a literal, linear sequence of events that either happened in the past, or could be happening now, or are yet to happen in the future when Jesus returns. But notice how John has woven all the 7s together. So the final 7 bowls come out of the 7th trumpet and the 7th seal. And the 7 trumpets emerge from the 7th seal. They're like nesting dolls. Each 7th contains the next 7. Also notice
no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what he had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying,
"Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away."
He who was seated on the throne said,
I am making everything new.
Then he said,
Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.
He said to me,
It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To him who is thirsty, I will give to drink without cost from the spring of the water of life. He who overcomes will inherit all this, and I will be his God, and he will be my son.